The first warning didn't arrive with shouting or headlines. It arrived quietly, too quietly. For years now, people around the palace have learned to measure danger not by noise, but by absence. When something truly destabilizing is coming, the phones don't ring publicly, statements aren't rushed out. Instead, conversations stop mid-sentence. Meetings happen off calendars, and people who usually disagree suddenly sound aligned. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the unsettling question no one wants to ask out loud. What if the most damaging chapter of the Sussex saga hasn't been aired yet, because it's never been meant for the public first? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because according to multiple accounts now circulating behind closed doors, Meghan Markle isn't writing a memoir in the way we've come to expect. She's not announcing it. She's not teasing it on social media. She's not framing it as healing or closure or reclaiming her voice. She's allegedly shopping it, and that distinction, small on the surface, has set off a level of concern inside palace circles that hasn't been seen in years. Not outrage, concern. That matters. If you step back for a moment, the contradiction is obvious. The palace has endured interviews, documentaries, books, podcasts, lawsuits, leaks, and years of relentless commentary. It has weathered all of that while maintaining its most powerful weapon: time, silence, the confidence that eventually public attention moves on. So why, now, would a set of allegedly leaked emails cause senior aides to reassess that confidence? Why would phrases like "what really happened" and names like Kate, Camilla, and Charles appearing together in the same breath trigger legal consultations rather than press rebuttals? And why are sources describing the mood not as defensive, but as precautionary? This story matters now because it's not about content. It's about leverage. For a long time, the assumption inside and outside the institution was that Meghan's most potent narratives had already been deployed, that whatever grievances existed had found their outlet, that whatever truths or versions of truth she wished to share had already been shared. But these leaked communications, if accurate, suggest something very different. They suggest selectivity, strategy, a careful holding back, not a release, a negotiation. And that reframes everything, because a memoir written for publication is one thing. A memoir quietly circulated among publishers, power brokers, and intermediaries, each chapter positioned as a potential revelation, is something else entirely. That's not storytelling. That's signaling. And the palace understands signaling better than anyone. Here's where the discomfort deepens. According to people familiar with the situation, the emails themselves are not explosive in a tabloid sense. There's no single line that reads like a bombshell, no quote that would instantly trend, no accusation that could be easily denied or litigated away. Instead, what unsettled those who saw them was the tone, measured, deliberate, almost procedural. This wasn't the language of someone venting or lashing out. It was the language of someone mapping options. There's an old rule in institutional crisis management. Emotional actors are predictable. Strategic ones are not. And the idea now circulating quietly, cautiously, is that Meghan may be positioning information not for catharsis, but for control, for optionality, for timing. Ask yourself this: why include Kate, Camilla, and Charles together? Not individually, together. That's not personal, that's structural. Kate represents continuity. Camilla represents legitimacy reclaimed over time. Charles represents authority itself. Placing them in the same narrative frame isn't about interpersonal conflict. It's about the spine of the monarchy. And that's why this isn't being treated as gossip. It's being treated as a potential pressure point. Another contradiction complicates things further. Publicly, the Sussexes have framed distance from the royal family as liberation. Privately, these emails suggest proximity still holds value, because proximity creates credibility, access, context. You can't sell royal secrets unless the buyer believes you are close enough to possess them. And that belief doesn't depend on proof, it depends on plausibility. This is where the palace's anxiety sharpens. Institutions like the monarchy don't fear lies as much as they fear ambiguity, because ambiguity invites imagination, and imagination fills gaps faster than facts ever can. There's also the question of timing. Why now? Why not during the peak of media attention? Why not when interest was highest, outrage loudest, positions most polarized? Because leverage works best when it's quiet. Several insiders have hinted at something that initially sounds counterintuitive. The palace isn't reacting because it assumes the book will be published. It's reacting because it can't be sure it will be, and that uncertainty is destabilizing. If a memoir is inevitable, you prepare responses. You line up context. You ride out the storm. But if a memoir exists primarily as a bargaining chip, if its power lies in its potential rather than its release, then the usual defenses don't apply. How do you rebut something that hasn't been said? How do you deny chapters no one has read? How do you prepare for revelations that may never surface but still influence decisions behind the scenes? This is the quiet panic no one sees. Not fear of exposure, but fear of precedent. Fear that a former insider has learned how to extract value from uncertainty itself. And here's the part that complicates the narrative even more. There's no clear evidence, at least not yet, that Meghan intends to harm the monarchy outright. No scorched earth language, no promises of destruction. In fact, sources describe the posture as restrained, almost careful, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if this isn't about revenge at all? What if it's about relevance? Or insulation? Or leverage in future negotiations we don't yet see? The palace has always relied on one fundamental assumption, that former royals eventually lose their power as distance grows. That memory fades. That access expires. But what if the opposite is happening? What if distance has allowed perspective, and perspective has increased the perceived value of the information she holds? That's the question now echoing through private offices, not press rooms. Because if Meghan can successfully shop a narrative without releasing it, if she can influence outcomes without ever publishing, then the rules change. Not just for her, for anyone who has ever stepped away from the institution carrying stories with them. This is why there has been no loud denial, no aggressive pushback, no dramatic statement from palace spokespeople. Silence this time isn't confidence, it's calculation. And according to one source close to the situation, the most chilling moment didn't come from reading the emails themselves. It came from realizing how the palace learned about them. Not from Meghan, not from Harry, but from a third party, someone who had no reason to protect palace sensitivities and no incentive to exaggerate. That's when the mood shifted. That's when concern replaced dismissal. Because once information begins circulating outside your line of sight, control becomes theoretical. And as one senior aide allegedly put it in words that have since been repeated more than once, if this is being discussed without us in the room, then we're already late. And that realization that the conversation may already be happening elsewhere is what leads directly into the next question. Who saw these emails first, and why did they decide the palace needed to know? Who saw the emails first? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because the answer, at least as it's been described to me, doesn't point to a journalist or a royal aide, or even someone formally inside the publishing world. It points to a person who sits in the overlap, a connector, someone who moves comfortably between money, media, and discretion. The kind of person who doesn't leak for attention and doesn't panic easily. And that's why when this person reached out to the palace, it wasn't framed as a warning, it was framed as a courtesy. You should know this is being discussed. Not you're about to be attacked. Not you're in trouble, just this exists and it's moving. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because the palace is used to hostile press. It is not used to polite notifications from neutral third parties. That's the kind of thing that happens when conversations are already underway, when decisions are being weighed elsewhere by people who don't answer to royal protocol. Here's what's striking. According to sources, the person who flagged the emails wasn't alarmist. They didn't dramatize the content. They didn't suggest catastrophe. In fact, they reportedly downplayed the immediacy. But they emphasized one thing, the structure, not the allegations, not the names, the structure of the pitch. That's what caught attention. Because what was being circulated didn't read like a memoir proposal in the traditional sense. It didn't begin with childhood reflections or emotional arcs. It didn't frame Meghan as a wounded figure seeking catharsis. It wasn't about healing. It was modular. Chapters outlined as standalone units, each one able to exist independently, each one focused on a specific relationship, a specific moment, a specific internal dynamic. Kate, Camilla, Charles, each framed not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a node, a pressure point. And that's when the room went quiet. You have to understand how unusual that is. Most tell-all projects, especially those tied to institutions, lean heavily on emotion, betrayal, hurt, rage, redemption. That makes them predictable. You can map the beats. You can anticipate the language. You can prepare. This was different. This read like someone had stepped back, taken inventory, and asked a very pragmatic question. What information carries the most weight? And with whom? That's not memoir logic. That's negotiation logic. And inside the palace, that triggered a recalibration. Because suddenly the question wasn't, what will she say? It was, who is she saying it to first? There's a myth that power inside institutions flows outward in obvious ways. Titles, statements, ceremonies, visibility. But real power often moves sideways, quietly, through channels that don't leave a paper trail until it's too late. And what these emails suggested, again, allegedly, was that Meghan had learned how to move sideways, not by threatening, not by accusing, but by offering. Offering access, offering context, offering perspective framed as truth. And the thing about offering is this: the receiver sets the price, which is why the palace didn't immediately respond with denial or dismissal. Doing so would have elevated the situation into a public confrontation. And public confrontations are exactly what you avoid when you're unsure how much leverage the other side actually has. Instead, the palace did what institutions do when faced with uncertainty. It paused, it listened, it gathered. People who had worked on previous Sussex-related crises were quietly looped back in. Legal advisors who had been dormant were asked to review hypothetical scenarios, not actual content because there was no content yet, but exposure pathways. What happens if this chapter leaks? What happens if that one doesn't, but is referenced? What happens if nothing is published, but everything is implied? Those are harder questions than most people think, because institutions are built to respond to events, not possibilities. And here, the possibility itself was the weapon. There's another detail that keeps surfacing in conversations with sources, and it's subtle but important. The emails, as described, didn't position the memoir as inevitable. They positioned it as conditional. That's a word that makes lawyers sit up straighter. Conditional on timing, on receptivity, on alignment, on, this is the phrase that reportedly raised eyebrows, appropriate context. Appropriate for whom? That's the unanswered part. Because if the memoir were simply destined for shelves, context wouldn't matter. It would be created through publicity, through reaction, through outrage. But if the memoir is being offered selectively, then context becomes strategic. It becomes about who is reading, not who is watching. And this is where the palace's long-standing playbook begins to fail. Silence works when the battlefield is public opinion, when stories are consumed en masse, when attention is the currency. But silence doesn't work in private rooms. It doesn't work when conversations are happening without microphones, without cameras, without timelines. One source put it to me this way, and it stuck. You can't freeze something that isn't public yet. You can only watch it move. And that's what the palace appears to be doing now. Watching, tracking, waiting. There's also the emotional layer, one that's rarely acknowledged openly, but which seeps into these situations regardless. For years, Meghan has been framed, sometimes unfairly, sometimes not, as reactive, emotional, impulsive, defined by grievance. These emails, if they exist as described, contradict that image entirely. They suggest patience. They suggest restraint. They suggest someone who is no longer trying to win an argument, but to shape an outcome. That shift is deeply unsettling to an institution that has relied on predictability, because emotional actors burn themselves out. Strategic ones don't. This raises another uncomfortable question, one that insiders are reluctant to voice, but clearly circling around. What if the palace misjudged the timeline? What if they assumed the window of risk had already closed, when in fact it had only been delayed? In retrospect, many now see signs they dismissed too quickly. The absence of certain stories, the careful avoidance of particular topics, the way some grievances were hinted at but never explored. At the time, that restraint was interpreted as limitation, as a lack of material, as exhaustion. Now, some wonder if it was curation, saving the most valuable pieces for a moment when their impact would be maximized not through shock, but through credibility. Because credibility doesn't come from volume, it comes from selectivity. And that's the real fear here. Not that Meghan will say everything, but that she won't. That she will say just enough to just the right people at just the right time, and that once those conversations start, the palace may not even know what promises are being made in its absence. It's also worth noting what hasn't happened. There's been no visible effort to discredit the claim, no anonymous briefing dismissing the idea as fantasy, no suggestion that this is all exaggerated. That silence isn't accidental. Discrediting a story requires certainty, and certainty is exactly what's missing. Instead, the palace appears to be operating under a different assumption, that the smartest move is to avoid escalating something that hasn't yet chosen its final form. But that restraint comes at a cost, because every day this possibility exists, it changes behavior. It alters calculations, it influences decisions quietly. People hesitate, they defer, they wonder what might surface next. And institutions, like individuals, are weakest when they hesitate. There's a phrase that keeps coming up in these conversations, often spoken sotto voce, as if naming it might make it real. Optionality, the idea that Meghan has preserved options while the palace has narrowed its own. Options to publish, options not to, options to excerpt, options to delay, options to leverage interest without commitment. And the palace? Its options are more limited. Respond publicly or not. Prepare legally or not. Engage privately or hold the line. None of those choices feel safe when you don't know the other side's endgame. Which brings us back to the emails themselves. Because for all the speculation, for all the concern, there's one thing that hasn't changed. Very few people have actually seen them. And that scarcity, intentional or not, has only amplified their power. Information is most dangerous when it's rumored but not accessible. When people can't verify it, but can't dismiss it either, that's the space this story now occupies. A space between certainty and denial, between threat and potential. And according to one person familiar with the early reactions, there was a moment, brief but telling, when someone senior asked a question that stopped the discussion cold. Are we sure this is meant to be read by us? Because that reframes everything. If the emails weren't intended to reach the palace directly, then the palace isn't the audience, it's the subject. And if that's true, then the real question isn't how the palace responds. It's who else is listening. And that realization leads straight into the next layer of this story, one that shifts the focus away from the palace entirely and toward the quiet marketplace where narratives, access, and power are traded long before the public ever sees them. There's a phrase that keeps surfacing in private conversations around the story, and it's deceptively simple. Market interest, not public interest, not reader demand, market interest. And the moment that phrase entered the discussion, the framing shifted again. Because market interest doesn't ask whether a story is true. It asks who wants it, who benefits from it, and what they're willing to pay financially, reputationally, strategically to have it first. This is where the distinction between writing a memoir and shopping one becomes impossible to ignore. A memoir written in isolation follows a familiar arc. An author sits down, reflects, reconstructs, remembers. Pain turns into prose. Memory becomes narrative. Eventually, a finished product exists, and then it's offered to the world. But shopping a memoir works in reverse. You don't begin with a finished book. You begin with fragments, with outlines, with chapters that are described, not delivered, with promises of access rather than pages of text. And that's what allegedly happened here. What circulated wasn't a manuscript. It wasn't even excerpts. It was a framework, a proposal designed to test appetite, to see which parts of the story resonated most, which names triggered interest, which angles generated pause rather than dismissal. That's not accidental. That's intelligence gathering. And this is where the emotional temperature inside the palace began to rise, not dramatically, but steadily. Because intelligence gathering suggests intent without commitment. It suggests someone is trying to understand the terrain before choosing a path. And that creates a new kind of vulnerability. If you're facing an attack, you defend. If you're facing a book, you prepare. But if you're facing a negotiation disguised as a story, you're already behind. Here's the uncomfortable contradiction that palace insiders are wrestling with. The very act of shopping a memoir can be more powerful than publishing one. Once a book is out, its impact is finite. It's reviewed, debated, dissected. Eventually, It settles into history. But when a book exists only as possibility, it remains fluid. Its influence adapts, and institutions built on tradition don't fare well under sustained questioning. There's also the strategic irony. By grouping Kate, Camilla, and Charles, the narrative avoids the appearance of targeting a single figure. It spreads the weight evenly. It suggests balance, which makes it harder to dismiss as bias. It looks considered, measured, and that perception matters, because credibility doesn't come from being right. It comes from appearing fair, and this framing, at least as described, appears calculated to achieve exactly that. This brings us to a subtle but critical shift in how the palace is thinking about the situation. Initially, the concern was reputational. Now, it's interpretive. How will this narrative be read? Who will read it first? And how will it shape conversations long before any public release? That's where the grouping of these names becomes most potent. It invites a holistic reassessment. It suggests that individual actions were shaped by institutional pressures, that decisions were less about personalities and more about preservation. And once that idea takes hold, it reframes everything, from press strategies to family dynamics. That's why the palace isn't rushing to discredit this. Discrediting would require specificity, and specificity invites counter-specificity. Instead, the strategy appears to be containment, limit the narrative spread, monitor interest, avoid escalation. But containment is only effective if the narrative stays static, and according to sources, it isn't. Interest is growing, quietly, not because of outrage, but because of curiosity. People want to know what perspective could connect these figures in a way that hasn't been publicly articulated before, and curiosity is hard to suppress. There's one final detail that's worth noting before we move on. According to those familiar with the outline, the chapters don't resolve their questions. They leave them open, they don't accuse, they invite interpretation. They don't conclude, they linger. That's a deliberate choice, because lingering questions are harder to put to rest than definitive claims. And that's where the palace's discomfort deepens into something closer to unease. Because once a narrative invites the audience to think rather than react, it embeds itself more deeply. And undoing that requires engagement, something the palace is structurally reluctant to do. Which brings us to the next stage of this story. Because once the palace recognized that this narrative wasn't personal but structural, once it understood that this wasn't about anger but about framing, it had to decide how to respond. Not publicly, but internally. And the decisions made in that quiet moment, who was consulted, what protocols were activated, which lines were drawn, mark a turning point, one that reveals just how seriously this possibility is being taken. And what the palace may be willing to do to prevent this story from defining it. The palace didn't erupt. That's the first thing people get wrong when they imagine moments like this. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic phone calls made in haste. What happened instead was far more telling. Things slowed down. Meetings that were usually routine suddenly doubled in length. Conversations drifted, circled back, stalled. People asked questions they already knew the answers to just to hear how others framed them. The tone shifted from confidence to calibration. This was not panic in the cinematic sense. It was something colder, more disciplined. This was an institution recognizing a variable it could not yet measure. Inside the palace, there's a deep institutional memory of crises, some public, some buried. And one lesson repeats itself across decades. The most dangerous moments are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones where the rules don't quite apply. This felt like that, because the alleged emails did not force an immediate response. They forced a reconsideration of posture. For years, the palace has relied on a familiar hierarchy of threats. Tabloids at the bottom, lawsuits somewhere in the middle. Books, especially memoirs, near the top, but still manageable. Each category has a playbook. This didn't fit any of them. It wasn't hostile press. It wasn't litigation. It wasn't even a book yet. It was a scenario. And scenarios are where institutions feel most exposed. One source described a moment when a senior advisor paused mid-discussion and said something quietly, almost reflexively. "We don't actually know what she wants." That admission changed the room, because up until that point, there had been an assumption, shared, rarely questioned, that Meghan's motivations were transparent. Attention, vindication, narrative control. But this new information, disrupted that certainty. If the goal were attention, she would have gone public already. If the goal were vindication, she would have framed herself as the injured party and invited sympathy. If the goal were narrative control, she would have released something definitive. But none of that was happening. Instead, what appeared to be happening was evaluation, testing, observation. And that made it harder to respond. Inside the palace, there's a strong bias toward action. Even silence is an action, carefully chosen, timed, managed. But this situation resisted action. Every potential move carried risk. A public denial could backfire if details emerged later. A private outreach could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, validation. Ignoring it entirely risked letting the narrative take shape elsewhere. So the palace did what it often does in moments of uncertainty. It compartmentalized. Different teams were asked to assess different dimensions of the problem, often without being told the full context. Legal looked at exposure. Communications looked at hypothetical fallout. Senior aides looked at internal dynamics. What they weren't doing, at least not yet, was coordinating a response, because coordination implies a direction. And no one was ready to choose one. There's an emotional contradiction at the heart of this phase that's hard to overstate. On the one hand, the palace has weathered far worse storms publicly. On the other, this felt more destabilizing. Why? Because public storms end. They burn bright, then fade. This felt like a slow leak. A drip that might never turn into a flood, but might never stop either. And slow leaks are corrosive. They don't destroy all at once. They weaken over time. That's why the word that kept appearing in internal conversations wasn't damage, it was exposure. Exposure doesn't require publication, it doesn't require proof, it only requires plausibility. And the alleged framing of these memoir chapters, measured, contextual, restrained, created plausibility without confrontation. That's a dangerous combination. Another factor deepened the unease, the absence of clear escalation from Meghan's side. No countdowns, no teasers. No media allies hinting at imminent release. Nothing. That restraint forced the palace to confront a possibility it rarely entertains, that it was not driving the tempo. Institutions like the monarchy are built around tempo control. Events unfold according to schedules. Statements are timed, appearances are curated. Here, the tempo was external and unpredictable. One insider described it this way. It felt like we were reacting to a shadow, not because it was threatening, but because we couldn't see its edges. That uncertainty began to influence behavior in subtle ways. People hesitated before signing off on unrelated initiatives. Conversations about future projects took on an extra layer of caution. There was an unspoken awareness that anything could be reinterpreted later, reframed through a narrative lens not yet revealed. That's the real cost of this kind of situation. It doesn't just threaten reputation, it alters decision-making. And altered decision-making compounds over time. There's also a psychological component that institutions rarely acknowledge, but which operates regardless. For years, the palace has positioned itself as the final authority on royal narratives. Even when stories emerge externally, the palace retains a sense of authorship, of ultimate perspective. This situation challenged that assumption because the narrative wasn't being contested publicly. It was being incubated privately. And that meant the palace wasn't arguing with a story, it was competing with an idea that suggested there was another version of events worth hearing. That idea alone erodes authority. One source recounted a moment during an internal discussion when someone asked, half-jokingly, "Do we even know what the chapters are called?" The laughter that followed was brief and uneasy, because no, they didn't. They knew themes, they knew names, they knew tone, but they didn't know structure. And structure is where meaning lives. A story's power isn't just in what it says, but in how it organizes information, what it foregrounds, what it delays, what it withholds. The alleged proposal's modular nature made this worse. If chapters could stand alone, they could surface independently, referenced without context, quoted selectively. That fragmentation is a nightmare for institutional response. You can rebut a book. You can't rebut fragments, especially when fragments circulate in private conversations. This is where legal advisors became more prominent, not because of imminent lawsuits, but because of hypotheticals. What if a chapter is referenced in a negotiation unrelated to publishing? What if a perspective influences a decision without ever becoming public? What if the memoir exists primarily as an influence document? These questions don't have clear answers. And that ambiguity is unsettling. There's also the emotional irony that keeps surfacing in these discussions. For years, critics accused Meghan of being impulsive, reactive, unstrategic. This approach, if it is indeed hers, contradicts that image entirely. It suggests long-term thinking, and long-term thinking is harder to counter than emotional outbursts because it doesn't burn itself out, it waits. The palace understands waiting. It has waited out scandals before, but those scandals were loud. Waiting out silence is different. Silence doesn't resolve itself. It lingers. And the longer it lingers, the more people project onto it. That projection is where narratives grow. Inside the palace, there's a deep awareness of how narratives evolve, how initial interpretations solidify into assumptions which then harden into beliefs. Once beliefs take hold, they're resistant to correction. That's why timing matters so much. And here, timing was out of the palace's control. Another detail that added to the discomfort, the lack of clear allies. In previous crises, the palace could rely quietly on certain media relationships, cultural norms, and institutional sympathies. This situation didn't activate those channels because there was nothing to push back against publicly. No headline, no claim, no accusation, just the possibility of a story. And that left allies uncertain how to act. Do you defend against something that hasn't happened? Do you reassure preemptively? Do you stay silent and hope it passes? None of those options felt satisfying. One senior figure reportedly asked a question that captured the mood perfectly. What if this isn't about us responding, but about us revealing our anxiety? Because overreaction would do exactly that. It would signal that the palace feared what might be said. And fear, once visible, becomes part of the narrative. That's why the response has been so restrained. Not because the palace doesn't care, but because it cares too much to move without clarity. There's a paradox at work here. The palace's greatest strength, its ability to endure, to wait, to absorb, has become a vulnerability. Because endurance assumes a known endpoint. This situation has none. The memoir may be published, it may not. It may be excerpted, it may remain private. It may influence decisions without ever surfacing. And that uncertainty creates a low-grade tension that's difficult to sustain indefinitely. People begin to ask questions. What's being discussed elsewhere? Who knows what? What assumptions are being made? And those questions start to shape behavior. That's when caution turns into constraint. That's when institutions begin to limit themselves. And that's when power quietly shifts. The palace isn't powerless here. Far from it. But it's operating without its usual advantage, clarity. And clarity is what allows decisive action. Without it, every move feels provisional. That provisionality is now baked into internal thinking. And it has led to a subtle but significant shift. The palace is no longer asking how to stop this. It's asking how to live with it, how to operate in a world where a former insider may hold narratives that can be activated or not at will. That's a different kind of challenge. It's not about defense, it's about adaptation. And adaptation is slow. One person close to the situation described the mood as a long inhale, not panic, preparation. Because when institutions inhale, they're bracing. They're gathering oxygen for something they sense may require endurance. And endurance in this case may involve choices that were once unthinkable. Private engagement, quiet compromise, strategic patience, or something else entirely. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because once the palace accepted that this wasn't a conventional threat, once it recognized that this was about leverage, timing, and interpretation, it had to confront another uncomfortable reality. The timing of this move may not be accidental. In fact, it may be perfect. And understanding why now, why this moment, why this climate, why this context, reveals just how calculated this situation may be. And why the palace's unease is not only justified, but growing. Why now? That question has been hovering over every private conversation connected to this story. Not as an accusation, as an analysis. Because timing in situations like this is rarely accidental. And when timing appears quiet, almost passive, that's usually when it's been most carefully chosen. At first glance, this seems like the worst possible moment to float a memoir. Public fatigue is real. The audience has moved on, or so it seems. The headlines aren't screaming. The outrage cycle has slowed. Sympathy has thinned. So why introduce uncertainty now instead of when attention was guaranteed? The answer, according to several people watching this unfold, lies in a counterintuitive truth the palace understands all too well. Leverage works best when no one is looking for it. When attention is loud, institutions are armored. They prepare. They expect confrontation. They brace for impact. But when attention is low, when the public has emotionally clocked out, that's when institutions are most exposed, because they relax, and relaxation breeds assumption. For years, the palace has operated under the assumption that the Sussex chapter had stabilized, not healed, not resolved, but stabilized enough to be predictable. Harry and Meghan had spoken, repeatedly. The contours of their grievances were familiar. The public had formed opinions. The institution had absorbed the damage. Nothing new was expected, and that's precisely why now is so effective. Because disruption doesn't require volume, it requires surprise. This alleged move doesn't collide with a crisis. It slips into a lull, and lulls are dangerous. Inside the palace, there's an acute awareness of cycles. Media cycles, public emotion cycles, institutional vulnerability cycles. The worst moment for an institution isn't when it's under attack. It's when it believes the attack phase has passed. That's when defenses lower. That's when assumptions calcify. And that's when a new variable can cause disproportionate unease. This is where the irony sharpens. Publicly, this feels like old news. Another chapter in a long saga, something that should have peaked years ago. Privately, it feels like a reset, not because of what's being said, but because of how it's being introduced. There's a phrase that's been repeated by people close to the situation, often with a kind of reluctant admiration. This landed under the radar. No press blitz, no leaks to tabloids, no preemptive outrage, just quiet circulation among people who matter. And that's intentional, because outrage triggers defense. Curiosity triggers engagement. This move, if that's what it is, appears designed to provoke the latter. Another factor makes the timing particularly effective. The monarchy at this moment is in a period of visible transition. Leadership is still consolidating. Roles are evolving. Expectations are being renegotiated internally and externally. Transitions create uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for reinterpretation. A narrative that suggests what really happened during a formative period lands differently when the institution itself is still redefining its present. It invites reassessment, not necessarily public reassessment, but internal. People begin to ask whether past decisions were optimal, whether different choices could have led to different outcomes. That kind of introspection is not inherently damaging, but it can be paralyzing if it coincides with external pressure. This is where timing intersects with psychology. If this move had been made at the height of public attention, it would have been dismissed by many as opportunistic, as piling on, as noise. Now it feels considered, delayed long enough to suggest restraint. Strategic patience, and patience carries credibility. One insider put it bluntly, if she were bluffing, she would have rushed. The delay itself becomes evidence. There's also the broader media climate to consider. Audiences today are skeptical of spectacle. They're less reactive to overt drama, more responsive to nuance, to ambiguity, to stories that promise hidden layers. A loud tell-all would struggle to cut through. A quiet, rumored one, especially one framed as selective and contextual, fits the current mood far better. It doesn't demand belief. It invites curiosity. And curiosity is sticky. Another reason the timing works is less obvious but more consequential. The palace is currently juggling multiple pressures, some visible, some not. When institutions are multitasking at scale, their capacity to respond to new variables diminishes. Attention becomes fragmented. Decision-making slows. And slow decision-making creates gaps. Those gaps are where influence operates. This isn't about overwhelming the palace. It's about nudging it off balance, not enough to provoke a public response, but enough to alter internal calculations. That's why this feels unsettling rather than explosive. It's not a blow, it's a tilt, and tilts are harder to correct than hits. There's also a personal dimension to timing that's rarely acknowledged. Time changes perception. What sounded like grievance years ago can sound like reflection now. What felt raw then can feel measured today. Distance lends credibility, and distance has been carefully maintained. The longer Meghan has remained relatively quiet on certain topics, the more plausible it becomes that she has something new, or at least something differently framed, to say. Silence, in this context, becomes a credential. That's a difficult thing for the palace to counter, because silence is also its primary tool. And when both sides wield silence, the balance of power becomes less clear. This leads to another uncomfortable realization. The palace's traditional strategy relies on attrition, waiting out stories, letting time dilute impact. But this move appears to weaponize time instead. It uses delay as a feature, not a flaw. And that flips the script. The palace is now waiting on something that may never happen, but whose possibility continues to shape behavior. That's exhausting. Institutions can sustain crises. They struggle to sustain suspense. Suspense requires constant vigilance. And vigilance drains resources, emotional, strategic, cognitive. People begin to anticipate rather than act. They second-guess decisions. They ask how things might look later, reframed through a narrative not yet revealed. That's where timing becomes leverage. Not by forcing action, but by delaying resolution. There's a moment, described by someone familiar with the internal mood, that captures this perfectly. During a discussion about an entirely unrelated initiative, someone paused and said, "We need to think about how this could be interpreted." Interpreted by whom? No one said, because the answer was obvious. Interpreted by a future narrative that might already be forming. That's the cost of this uncertainty. It bleeds into everything, and that bleed is slow enough to go unnoticed until it isn't. Another layer of timing has to do with credibility cycles. Public trust in institutions fluctuates. It rises and falls based on broader cultural forces, not just internal behavior. We're currently in a moment of institutional skepticism. People question authority reflexively. They seek alternative perspectives. A narrative framed as what really happened lands differently in this climate than it would have a decade ago. It doesn't have to be proven. It has to be plausible. And plausibility is easier to achieve when trust is already fragile. The palace is acutely aware of this. It knows that defending itself publicly in this climate risks appearing defensive, but remaining silent risks appearing evasive. That's the bind timing has created. And then there's the most unsettling possibility of all. What if this timing isn't about the palace at all? What if it's about someone else being ready? A publisher, a platform, an intermediary. What if interest has reached a threshold where silence is no longer about waiting, but about choosing the moment of maximum effect? That's the question insiders are now asking quietly, because market interest doesn't peak at the same time as public interest. It peaks when decision makers feel conditions are right, and those conditions are often invisible from the outside. This would explain why the emails, if they exist, were circulated now, not because the story is urgent, but because the environment is receptive. Receptive to complexity, receptive to reinterpretation, receptive to narratives that don't shout, but suggest. And that receptivity is what worries the palace, because it can't control it. There's no lever to pull, no statement to issue, no deadline to count down, just a growing sense that something is in motion and that its momentum may be building quietly. One person close to the situation described the timing as immaculate, in a way that feels intentional, not dramatic, not aggressive. Just precise, and precision is rarely accidental. This brings us to the heart of the palace's unease. If this move had been clumsy, it would have been dismissed. If it had been loud, it would have been countered. If it had been emotional, it would have been waited out. But it's none of those things. It's quiet, delayed, measured, and that suggests foresight. Foresight implies planning. Planning implies an end game. And that's what no one inside the palace feels they understand yet. What is the end game? Is it publication? Is it negotiation? Is it influence without exposure? Is it something else entirely? Without knowing that, every response risks being the wrong one. And that's why timing matters so much. Because timing isn't just about when something happens, it's about when someone else feels forced to respond. And right now, the palace doesn't feel forced. It feels watched. That's a dangerous place for an institution accustomed to being the observer, not the observed. And as this sense of being watched settles in, it pushes the palace toward a realization it has avoided for years. This situation may not be resolvable through patience alone. At some point, a choice will have to be made. Engage, ignore, or adapt. Each carries consequences. And the longer the timing remains uncertain, the more those consequences begin to overlap. Which leads us to the next shift in this story. Because once the palace began to grasp how perfectly timed this move might be, its greatest fear began to crystallize. Not exposure, not embarrassment, but precedent. The fear that if this works, even partially, it will change the rules for everyone who comes after. And that fear, more than anything else, is what's now driving the quiet urgency behind closed doors. What if the palace isn't afraid of what's in the book at all? That question surfaced quietly, almost tentatively, after weeks of circular analysis. It wasn't posed as a theory, more like a release of pressure, a way to articulate something that had been felt but not yet named. Because fear implies anticipation of harm, and harm implies content. But what if content isn't the problem? What if the real threat is what happens if this approach works? That's when the word that had been hovering at the edges of these conversations finally moved to the center: precedent. Institutions can survive scandal, they can even survive exposure. What they struggle to survive is imitation. And this situation, if it unfolds the way some now fear, has the potential to create a template for how power can be exercised from the outside. That's what's keeping senior figures awake. Not Meghan Markle specifically, but the method. For decades, the monarchy has maintained a kind of informational hierarchy. Those inside speak carefully, if at all. Those who leave are expected to fade. Distance is supposed to equal dilution. That assumption has held, more or less, because no one has challenged it in quite this way. Books have been written before, interviews given, even tell-alls published, but they've all followed the same pattern: public, loud, emotional, finite. This doesn't. This operates in the space before publication, before commitment, before the public has anything to react to. And that's new. If this works, if leverage can be created without release, then the entire balance shifts. Suddenly, the most powerful position isn't inside the institution. It's just outside it, close enough to know things, far enough away to be untouchable. That's the nightmare scenario, because once that model exists, it doesn't stay contained. Others will notice. Others will learn. Others will ask a simple, dangerous question: why didn't I do that? And that's where precedent becomes contagion. The palace understands this instinctively. It has spent centuries controlling not just behavior, but expectation. Expectation is everything. People behave differently when they believe certain outcomes are possible. If former insiders believe that stories can be monetized, leveraged, or weaponized without public disclosure, then silence stops being a duty and starts being a bargaining chip. That's an institutional shift, and it's one the palace has no appetite for. This is why the internal tone has shifted from reactive to philosophical. People aren't asking, how bad could this be? They're asking, what does this change? Because once rules change, you can't unchange them. One source described a moment that felt like a line being crossed, not by Meghan, but by the institution's own thinking. During a discussion about hypothetical outcomes, someone said, if she gets something out of this without publishing, then we've taught everyone else how to do it. The room went quiet because that's not a problem you can litigate. You can't sue a lesson. You can't issue a statement to undo a strategy. Once a method proves effective, it spreads. And the palace's traditional defenses, dignity, silence, continuity, aren't designed to stop that kind of spread. They're designed to outlast storms, not to prevent innovation. This brings us to another uncomfortable truth. For years, the palace has benefited from a cultural assumption that proximity to power comes with obligation, that those who leave carry a kind of moral debt, that discretion is the price of access. But cultural assumptions shift, and this situation suggests that the debt may no longer feel binding. If Meghan is indeed positioning information as leverage, then she's implicitly rejecting the idea that discretion is owed indefinitely. She's reframing it as optional, conditional, transactional. That's a radical shift, and it doesn't matter whether one agrees with it. What matters is that it exists, because once discretion becomes negotiable, the institution loses one of its most powerful tools. This is where the emotional contrast becomes sharp. Publicly, the monarchy projects timelessness, stability, the sense that it operates above transactional logic. Privately, it's confronting the reality that transactional logic may now apply to it. And that's destabilizing. There's also the issue of credibility. If Meghan were widely perceived as unreliable, this wouldn't be a concern, but she isn't. Her narratives have been contested, yes, debated, challenged, but she's also been validated in certain ways, vindicated in others. She occupies an ambiguous space, and ambiguity is dangerous because it prevents easy dismissal. If she were clearly wrong, the palace could ignore her. If she were clearly right, the palace could respond. But ambiguity, Leah. If the palace engages privately, it never admits it. That's rule one. No paper trail, no acknowledgement. No signal that contact has been made. Because the moment engagement becomes visible, the balance shifts. What was a contained conversation becomes a precedent in itself. But here's the uncomfortable reality insiders are circling. Private engagement may already be the only rational option, not because the palace wants to negotiate, but because refusing to engage carries its own risks. This is the paradox now tightening around the institution. For decades, the palace's posture has been absolute. It does not bargain with pressure. It does not reward threats. It does not respond to ultimatums. But this isn't an ultimatum, and that distinction matters more than it appears. Ultimatums are explicit. They force reaction. They create lines in the sand. This situation is deliberately vague. No demands have been made publicly, no conditions articulated, no deadlines imposed. That ambiguity is what makes it so difficult to confront. Because how do you refuse something that hasn't been asked? Inside the palace, there's a long-standing sensitivity to the optics of engagement. Any private outreach risks being interpreted, if it ever surfaced, as admission of vulnerability. And yet, total silence carries another risk. If conversations are happening elsewhere, publishers, intermediaries, cultural brokers, and the palace remains absent, it loses its ability to shape outcomes, not publicly, privately. That's the real danger. Power doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It just relocates. This is why the tone inside the palace has shifted from defensive to exploratory. Not in the sense of reaching out directly, but in the sense of mapping scenarios where engagement might occur indirectly, through intermediaries, through signals, through calibrated moves that test receptivity without committing to anything. It's delicate and it's unfamiliar. One source described it as trying to touch something without leaving fingerprints. Because fingerprints imply ownership, responsibility, acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is what the palace wants to avoid at all costs. Here's where the emotional tension sharpens. For years, the palace has been accused, sometimes fairly, of being cold, detached, unwilling to listen. This situation flips that narrative on its head. Now, listening may be the only viable strategy, but listening in private is invisible, which means the palace risks being accused of indifference while quietly recalibrating behind the scenes. That gap between perception and action is widening, and gaps invite speculation. Another layer complicates this further. If the palace engages privately and succeeds, if it manages to diffuse the situation without publication, it may solve the immediate problem, but it creates another. It validates the method. Even if no one ever knows the details, the outcome will be observed. Stories will circulate, assumptions will form. People will notice that something didn't happen and wonder why. Absence, again, becomes evidence. And evidence fuels imitation. That's the trap. Engage, and you risk teaching a lesson. Don't engage, and you risk losing influence. Neither option preserves the old rules. This is why some insiders believe the palace's true objective isn't resolution. It's delay. Not indefinite delay, but controlled delay. Delay long enough to reduce the value of the narrative. Delay long enough for interest to cool. Delay long enough for conditions to change. But delay only works if the other side is waiting too. And that's the uncertainty no one can resolve. Is Meghan waiting, or is she moving quietly, deliberately, without the palace in the room? There's a moment described by someone close to these discussions that captures the tension perfectly. A senior figure, after listening to hours of analysis, reportedly asked a simple question: what happens if we do nothing and nothing happens? At first, that sounded reassuring. Maybe the memoir never materializes. Maybe interest fades. Maybe this all dissipates. But then came the follow-up. And what happens if we do nothing and something does? That's the risk. Because doing nothing doesn't freeze time. It just removes you from the conversation. And conversations don't stop because one party refuses to attend. They just move elsewhere. This is why the palace's internal thinking has become increasingly nuanced. The question is no longer whether to engage, it's how to engage without being seen as engaging. That's a difficult needle to thread. It involves signals rather than statements, changes in posture rather than overt moves, subtle shifts that suggest awareness without acknowledgement. And those shifts are already being noticed by those watching closely. Small things, a change in tone in unrelated briefings, an unusual delay in decisions that would normally be straightforward, a sudden emphasis on future-facing narratives rather than retrospective ones. These aren't reactions. They're adjustments, and adjustments signal that something is being taken seriously. There's also the question of trust. If private engagement were to occur, who would lead it? The palace is not a monolith. It's a network of relationships, hierarchies, and sensitivities. Choosing the wrong intermediary could backfire spectacularly. Too senior, and it looks like capitulation. Too junior, and it lacks credibility. Too direct, and it risks exposure. Too indirect, and it risks misunderstanding. This is why, according to some, the palace may be testing the waters through silence itself. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It's an invitation. An invitation for the other side to make the next move, to clarify intent, to reveal whether this is a waiting game or a moving one. But waiting games are dangerous when both sides believe time is on their side, because eventually, someone breaks. And when they do, the outcome is rarely symmetrical. Another emotional contradiction sits beneath all of this. For years, the palace has framed itself as resilient precisely because it does not react. That restraint has been its moral high ground. This situation tests that philosophy because restraint here may be indistinguishable from helplessness. And helplessness is corrosive. It undermines confidence internally, even if the public never sees it. Institutions rely on internal belief as much as external legitimacy. If people inside begin to doubt the efficacy of established strategies, adaptation becomes inevitable. And adaptation, once begun, changes identity. That's the existential risk no one wants to articulate openly. This isn't just about a memoir. It's about whether the palace can continue to operate under the same assumptions it always has. Assumptions about loyalty, about discretion, about the cost of speaking out. Those assumptions are being stress tested, and stress tests don't always produce the results you expect. There's also a human element that's often overlooked. Behind institutions are people. People with careers, reputations, and legacies. People who don't want to be remembered as the ones who mishandled a quiet crisis because they followed outdated rules. That personal risk influences behavior. It makes people cautious. It makes them open to options they might have dismissed before. That's where private engagement becomes tempting. Not as surrender, but as risk management, and risk management is deeply ingrained in institutional thinking. Still, there's a line the palace is desperate not to cross. Any engagement must not appear transactional, because transaction implies equivalence, and equivalence undermines hierarchy. The monarchy's authority rests in part on the idea that it operates above negotiation, that it doesn't trade, that it doesn't bargain, even when it does, quietly. So if engagement happens, it must be framed as something else: clarification, listening, understanding, anything but negotiation. But the other side may see it differently. And perception, again, is everything. This is why some insiders believe the palace is hoping for a specific outcome. Not publication, not silence, but ambiguity. A continued state where the memoir exists as possibility, but never crystallizes into event. Where leverage remains potential, not kinetic. Where both sides avoid escalation by never forcing a resolution. It's an uneasy equilibrium, but it's familiar. Institutions are good at living with unresolved tensions. They do it all the time. The problem here is that unresolved tensions don't stay static. They evolve. They attract interest. They invite interpretation. And over time, they shape behavior. That's already happening. Decisions are being filtered through hypothetical future narratives. Actions are being weighed against possible reinterpretation. That's a cost. And it accumulates. One person close to the palace described it as operating with a shadow audience in mind. An audience that may never see the story, but whose imagined reaction influences choices anyway. That's exhausting. And exhaustion leads to mistakes. which is why the palace may not be able to sustain this indefinitely. At some point, the ambiguity will need to be resolved. Either the memoir moves closer to publication, or it recedes. Either engagement happens, or it doesn't. Either the palace adapts, or it holds the line. Those choices are coming, and the timing of them may depend on something no one inside the palace can control. Meghan's next move, not what she says, but what she does, because actions, unlike possibilities, force response. And according to some watching closely, there are signs that the situation may be shifting again. Subtle signs, signals that suggest the waiting phase may be nearing its end. Which raises the most pressing question of all. If the memoir never comes out, who benefits? And if it does, who loses control first? Those questions lead directly into the next chapter, where the focus shifts from the palace's internal calculus to the external legal and structural boundaries everyone is suddenly afraid to test. Because some secrets aren't protected by loyalty, they're protected by law. And once legal lines are approached or crossed, the entire situation changes. There's a reason the conversation has quietly shifted toward legal boundaries. Not because anyone believes a lawsuit is imminent, but because law is the last line institutions reach for when norms stop working. Loyalty can fray, discretion can become optional, silence can be reinterpreted, but law draws lines. And when people start asking where those lines actually are, it's a sign something fundamental has changed. Inside the palace, legal advisors were not brought in to draft threats or prepare injunctions. That would have been premature and frankly counterproductive. Instead, they were asked a more unsettling question. What exactly is protected? Not in theory, in practice. What information is legally constrained? What falls into gray zones? What relies on convention rather than enforceable obligation? Because the palace has long operated on a blend of law and custom. Formal NDAs exist, yes, but much of what keeps former insiders quiet is cultural expectation rather than contractual force. That distinction rarely matters until it does. And this situation has forced a reckoning with how thin that line can be. One advisor reportedly framed it bluntly, "We've relied on people choosing not to speak. That's not the same as them being unable to." That realization landed hard, because choosing not to speak is a moral decision. Being unable to speak is a legal one. And moral decisions are personal. Legal ones are institutional. This is where anxiety crept in. Not panic, not fear, but something colder. A recognition that certain assumptions had never been stress tested at this scale. The palace began quietly inventorying its safeguards. Who signed what? When? Under what jurisdiction? With what enforcement mechanisms? But even as those questions were asked, another, more uncomfortable truth emerged. Legal protection is rarely absolute, especially when narratives are framed carefully, especially when information is contextual rather than explicit, especially when claims are not stated as facts, but as perspective. That's the loophole everyone is staring at, because law is designed to regulate statements. It struggles to regulate interpretation. If someone says, "This happened," that can be challenged. If someone says, "This is how it felt," or "This is how it appeared," or "This is what I understood at the time," the ground shifts. And memoirs live in that space. They are not depositions, they are recollections, which makes them slippery. The palace knows this. It has dealt with it before. But the difference here is timing and intent. Most memoirs arrive as finished products. Their legal exposure can be assessed, risks quantified, responses prepared. This one, allegedly, exists in fragments, and fragments are harder to evaluate because you don't know what's been softened, what's been sharpened, what's been withheld. You don't know where memory ends and interpretation begins, and you don't know which version might eventually surface. That uncertainty complicates legal analysis. You can't assess risk without content, and you can't demand content without escalating. So the palace is left with hypotheticals. What if a chapter frames a decision as systemic rather than personal? What if it suggests pressure rather than instruction? What if it implies patterns without naming perpetrators? Those are difficult scenarios because they don't accuse, they insinuate, and insinuation, while corrosive, is rarely illegal. This is why the legal conversation has been cautious, almost academic. No one is reaching for injunctions. No one is threatening action. They're mapping boundaries, understanding where leverage exists and where it doesn't. One legal advisor reportedly made an observation that shifted the tone of the discussion. If this stays unpublished, there's nothing to challenge. That sounds obvious, but it carries weight. As long as the memoir exists as potential, legal tools are blunt. You can't sue a rumor, you can't silence a possibility. You can only respond once something is concrete, and concreteness is exactly what the situation lacks. That's the irony. The palace is legally safest when the story is most dangerous. Because danger, at this stage, is abstract. It lives in anticipation, not in action. That's why there's such unease about the possibility of partial disclosure. An excerpt here, a reference there, a conversation behind closed doors where a chapter is summarized rather than shared. Those moments don't trigger legal remedies, but they influence outcomes. They shape perceptions, they alter decisions, and they do so without leaving a trail. This is the nightmare scenario for any institution. Influence without accountability, pressure without confrontation, change without event. Law is ill-equipped to handle that, which is why some inside the palace have begun to ask a different question. Not, what can we stop, but what can we tolerate? That's a subtle shift, but a profound one, because it acknowledges limits. Limits of control, limits of authority, limits of legal reach. It suggests a willingness to accept some level of ambiguity as the price of avoiding escalation. But tolerance has boundaries, and identifying those boundaries is now the focus. There are certain things the palace believes it can absorb. Interpretation, critique, even implied criticism of process. But there are other things, specific disclosures, private communications, operational details, that cross into legally sensitive territory. The challenge is that those lines aren't always clear in advance, and a skilled narrator can dance right up to them without crossing. That's what worries legal advisors most, not a blatant breach, but a careful approach that stays just inside permissible territory while still doing damage. That kind of precision is difficult to counter, and it suggests intent, which circles back to the earlier fear that this is not emotional expression, but strategic positioning. The legal conversation has also surfaced another uncomfortable reality. Even when legal remedies exist, using them carries cost. Litigation invites discovery. Discovery invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites narratives the palace may prefer to avoid. In some cases, suing to silence a story can amplify it. That's not hypothetical. It's precedent. The palace knows this, which is why legal action is considered a last resort, not a first response. But the mere fact that these discussions are happening at all is telling. It suggests that the situation has moved beyond public relations, beyond media management, into the realm of structural risk. And structural risk is taken seriously. There's also an international dimension to consider. Jurisdictions matter. Publishing markets matter. What's constrained in one country may not be in another. Global narratives don't respect borders. And once a story enters the global marketplace of ideas, controlling it becomes exponentially harder. That's another reason the palace is wary of provoking publication. Once the genie is out, it doesn't go back in. Better, some argue, to live with ambiguity than to invite permanence. But ambiguity has its own cost. It keeps everyone guessing. It creates a climate of caution. It forces decisions to be filtered through hypothetical future exposure. That's exhausting, and exhaustion leads to error. This is why some legal advisors have quietly emphasized the importance of preparation over reaction. If publication happens, be ready. If it doesn't, maintain equilibrium, but don't force the issue. Forcing the issue risks transforming possibility into reality, and reality, once formed, is harder to manage. Another factor complicates the legal landscape even further: intent. If the memoir were framed explicitly as retaliation, legal arguments might find traction, but if it's framed as reflection, context, or personal truth, intent becomes subjective. Courts are wary of policing personal narrative. They tread carefully, and that caution limits the palace's options. This has led to a kind of legal stalemate. Everyone is aware of the boundaries, everyone knows where the risks lie, but